August 1944. A gravel town square in a village near Rennes, France. Sunlight hits the stone walls of a centuries-old church, where 45 civilians kneel with their hands pressed against the back of their necks. They do not move. They barely breathe. At the edge of the dust lie 5 bodies. One is a 16-year-old boy. Another is the local village baker, both killed just hours ago. A wooden sign driven into the dirt carries a warning written in stark black ink. For every German soldier killed by partisans, 10 hostages will be executed. The shadow of the church steeple grows longer across the square as the afternoon fades. The remaining 45 prisoners have been told they will face the firing squad at sunset if the American army does not halt its advance. General George S. Patton will soon discover this clearing, and his response will turn an executioner's written schedule into an absolute trap. This is the story of a ruthless rearguard commander who thought he could use civilian lives as a tactical shield, and the general who broke that calculation with absolute force. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the evidence no order could erase. First Lieutenant Carlos Medina was 26 years old. He came from Laredo, Texas. He led a scout platoon in the Third Army. Medina had grown up along the Rio Grande, learning how to track across broken brush and read the dust for hidden dangers. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. By August 1944, he had lost his younger brother to an artillery barrage in Italy and carried a jagged piece of shrapnel in his own right shoulder. His men trusted his quiet eyes and his steady hand. On that August afternoon, Medina rolled his armored car into the edge of the French village and saw 45 human beings staring down their own graves. Oberleutnant Gerhard Meyer was 33 years old. He came from Munich. He commanded the rear guard detachment left behind to slow the American momentum. Meyer was a true believer in the total authority of the Reich, convinced that terror was a legitimate tool of military logistics. He wore a perfectly tailored field blouse, unblemished by the retreat, and an iron cross pinned neatly above his pocket. He carried a silver cigarette case and kept his boots polished to a high mirror shine, despite the mud of the French roads. Meyer believed that occupied populations were merely fuel to be consumed for the defense of Germany. He had just adjusted his cap when the American scouts halted their vehicles at the entrance of the village square. By August 1944, the German occupation of France was fracturing under a massive Allied hammer. The breakthrough at Avranches had unhinged the entire German line in Normandy, sending the Third Army pouring into the Brittany Peninsula. Columns of American armor moved with unprecedented speed, bypassing major strongpoints and slicing through the rear echelons of a retreating enemy. For the German army, the standard rules of engagement had dissolved into a frantic, desperate race toward the east. Communication lines were severed, supply dumps were burning, and isolated units found themselves cut off from their central command. In this environment of total collapse, field commanders resorted to systematic brutality to protect their flanks. The High Command had long authorized strict reprisal measures across the occupied territories to suppress local resistance networks. When an army is in full retreat, fear becomes its primary defensive weapon. Many Allied officers encountered the aftermath of these harsh measures during the advance, often documenting the scenes before continuing their pursuit of the retreating enemy columns. The chaotic nature of the fast-moving front meant that small rear-guard detachments held absolute power over the villages they passed through, operating with a sense of lawless impunity. A single ambush on a supply truck or a cut telephone wire could trigger the immediate arrest of entire neighborhoods. The local populations were trapped between a rising underground resistance movement and a retreating occupier that used execution squads to guarantee its safety. Most tactical leaders focused entirely on the road ahead, leaving the resolution of these civilian crises to the administrative units following far behind the armor. But the swift advance of the scout platoons meant that the front line was no longer a neat line on a map. The war was now a series of sudden, violent collisions in public squares. First Lieutenant Carlos Medina stepped away from his armored car with his hands raised, holding a white handkerchief high above his helmet. He walked alone into the center of the gravel square, his boots crunching softly in the heavy silence. 3 of his scouts kept their rifles trained on the perimeter from the shadows of the tree line. Oberleutnant Gerhard Mayer stood near the steps of the stone church, watching the American approach with a slow, deliberate smirk. He did not lower his pistol. Medina stopped 10 paces from the German officer, keeping his eyes flat. He spoke through the interpreter, who stood a few feet behind his shoulder. He stated that the village was entirely surrounded by the vanguard of the Third Army and demanded that the hostages be released immediately. Mayer pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket, tapped a cigarette against his thumbnail, and lit it without breaking eye contact. He spat a stream of gray smoke into the warm afternoon air. He told the lieutenant that he did not take orders from a scout platoon leader. He pointed his finger toward the wooden sign driven into the dirt. He stated that a German soldier had been killed on the road outside town by coward partisans, and the laws of reprisal were absolute. Medina kept his voice low and steady. He said that the 5 people lying at the edge of the square had nothing to do with the ambush on the road. He said that executing civilians was a direct violation of international law and that the war would be over soon. He told Mayer that his detachment had no escape route left, and that laying down their arms was the only rational choice. Mayer laughed, a sharp nasal sound that echoed against the church doors. He looked down at his highly polished boots, then back up at Medina. He stated that the local population belonged to the Reich until the final retreat was complete. He said that the schedule was already written and posted on the wall. He told the American that the 45 people kneeling in the dirt were fuel for the defense of his perimeter. He stated that if the American vehicles did not withdraw past the river by sunset, every single one of them would be shot against the wall. Medina looked at the families kneeling in the dust, their faces gray with terror. He knew his 6 scouts could not win a direct firefight against 20 dug-in Germans without killing the people in the crossfire. He looked back at Mayer and said that he was making a fatal mistake. Mayer turned his back on the lieutenant and walked toward his men, waving his hand in dismissal. He shouted an order to his soldiers to prepare the first group of 10 hostages for the church wall. Medina slowly backed out of the square, keeping his hands up until he reached the cover of the armored car. He grabbed the microphone of his field radio and called back to the main column. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the edge of the square within the hour. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory-handled revolvers rested in the holsters on his hips. The general did not wait for his driver to open the door. He stepped down into the gravel, his eyes scanning the kneeling prisoners, the sign, and the 5 bodies lying in the dirt. He walked straight toward the church steps, where Medina stood with the captured German detachment. The room grew entirely silent. Patton looked at Mayer, then at the sheet of paper tacked to the church door. Patton asked if that was the execution schedule. Mayer straightened his uniform jacket and stated that it was a standard military directive for reprisal. Patton asked who had signed it. Mayer replied that he had ordered it himself, under the authority of the High Command, to secure his rear guard. Patton asked if the 5 dead civilians had carried weapons. Mayer stated that the identity of the specific partisans did not matter under the rules of 10-to-1 retaliation. Patton studied him for a cold moment. Then he spoke. "You call this a military directive. You stand here with your polished boots and your clean uniform, and you believe you are conducting warfare. This is not warfare. This is terrorism. You wrote a roster for murder. You organized the deaths of teenagers and bakers, as if you were scheduling kitchen duty for your barracks. A soldier fights the man who holds a rifle. A coward lines up unarmed schoolteachers against a stone wall because he is afraid of the dark on the road outside town. The lieutenant here brought 6 men into this square and saved 45 lives without firing a single round into the crowd. He used intelligence and speed. You used 50 hostages as a shield because your army is broken and your lines are collapsing. You have a choice. You will take that paper down from the door with your own hands. You will stand in this square while my staff photographs every name on that list. And you will sign a full confession of this order before the sun goes down. If you refuse, I will line your detachment up against that exact church wall before the shadow reaches the well. Decide now." Mayer looked at the general, then at the heavy cameras the American photographers were pulling from their vehicles. His hand shook as he reached for the paper. The verdict was carried out under the direct supervision of Patton's signal officers. 2 tactical photographers stepped forward, their heavy-speed graphic cameras slung over their olive uniforms. Mayer stood in the center of the square, his fingers trembling as he held up the edges of the printed execution schedule. The bright flashbulbs popped in rapid succession, illuminating the white church wall and casting sharp shadows across the dirt. Mayer swallowed hard, the smell of burnt magnesium and engine exhaust hanging thick in the warm afternoon air. Every civilian survivor looked on from the steps, watching the German officer hand over the signed document that detailed his own crime. The 20 captured rearguard soldiers were forced to stand in a single line, their hands raised as American scouts secured their weapons. They watched their commander bow his head to sign the typed confession on the hood of a mud-splashed jeep. Patton stood motionless, watching the process finish before he ordered. The prisoners marched to the rear, under tight guard. The remaining 45 hostages were allowed to stand, rushing to embrace their families as the sunset finally faded behind the church spire. The document was sealed in a leather pouch, transforming a tool of terror into evidence for a tribunal. First Lieutenant Carlos Medina returned home to Laredo, Texas, after the end of hostilities in Europe. He married his childhood sweetheart, took over his family's cattle ranching business along the river, and lived a long, quiet life focused on his community. He kept a small, framed photograph of the French village square inside his desk drawer, though he rarely opened it. Medina died in 1982, remembered by his neighbors as a soft-spoken man who never boasted about his service. Oberleutnant Gerhard Meyer was handed over to Allied authorities and stood trial before a military tribunal for his actions in the French village. The signed confession and the photographed execution schedule became central evidence for the prosecution, rendering any defense obsolete. He was convicted of war crimes and served 14 years in a federal prison before being released in 1959. Mayer returned to Munich, where he worked as an administrative clerk and lived out his remaining years in total obscurity, remaining bitter about his conviction until his death in 1974. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident near Rennes in his public briefings or his post-war press conferences. He simply placed the full documentation, including the photographs of the execution schedule, into his personal operational files. He did write about the confrontation once in a private letter to his wife, noting that the only way to defeat a system built on terror was to meet it with immediate, unyielding tactical speed. Some historians argue that Patton acted outside the strict boundaries of conventional Army regulations by imposing such immediate, personalized demands on a captured enemy officer before a formal military tribunal could convene. They suggest that tactical commanders should leave evidentiary collection entirely to specialized legal branches to avoid disrupting the momentum of the frontline advance. Others argue that his rapid intervention was a brilliant exercise in tactical command, demonstrating that swift executive action is the only effective way to preserve civilian lives during a fast-moving retreat. They contend that documenting the crime on the spot prevented the destruction of critical evidence. What is certain is that the photographed roster served as an unassailable confession at trial. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the documentation entirely to the war crimes investigators who arrived days later? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the evidence no order could erase, make sure to subscribe.